Hello and welcome to this tutorial where I'm going to take a look at how we can use different cameras in our games in order to give the player a different perspective on what's going on in the game. So in this scenario I am roaming around this surveillance office and I want to be able to interact with this PC and be able to see the live feed from some CCTV camera like this one over here in this corner, for example. So I'm going to look at how we go about doing that. And by doing that, that will kind of give us a basic grasp of what's going on with the cameras and how we can swap between different cameras and return back to our player. So let's get started. So the first thing to note is if I go to the primitives tab, I can find this camera primitive. If I click on that and then click anywhere in my game world, that'll add a camera into my game world. It's invisible, so you might need to make sure that the select tool is selected in order to move it around and to be able to see it. And you can move it and rotate it just like any entity in the game world. But the easiest way to move the camera is to position your drone exactly where you want the camera to, what you want the camera to be able to see. Then with your camera selected, scroll down in the entity editor over here and click the move to drone button. And that will essentially move that camera and rotate it to be exactly where the drone is at the moment and see exactly what the drone is seeing. So once you've got a camera in your game world and you've set it up to be looking at the direction you want it to look at, how do we make it so that the camera changes from the one that follows the player around to that one over there? That's going to take a little bit of scripting. And so what we'll do is we'll add a script to this camera. Entity, add script. I'm going to create a new script, and this is going to be called camera swap script. Then I'm going to edit this asset to open it up. So in here, I'm going to call a function from interacting with that computer. So when I interact with this PC, I want the camera to change from the one behind the player to this one over here. So we're going to need to write a function in our camera swap script. And this is going to be called activate camera. Now, when this is called, this will be called from the onInteractor method of that computer. And so that can actually pass us whoever just interacted with the computer. And it passes it as a variable which sits between these two brackets, but we can then use that variable until we hit the end of this function. So I'm going to capture the variable by writing the name player. That will now be whoever has interacted with the computer. And then I'm going to get hold of the user that's controlling that player and set their camera to this camera entity. So player, get user, set camera. Notice there's two options here. I can choose the first one, which asks for a camera and then a number to transition between the two, or just set the camera to whatever camera. So to keep things simple, I'm going to do this second option here. So I'm going to do set camera, self get entity. So that the script is attached to this camera. So by doing self get entity, I'm getting hold of the camera. Now this function isn't called yet, so running the game now won't do anything. What we need to do is set it up so that we can call this function when we interact with the computer. So I'm going to click on the computer, find the onInteract event and click new binding. Then I just drag my camera into the entity like this. The script will be automatically selected for us and I choose the activate camera event. If I test the game now and walk over to that computer and interact with it, it will show me the feed or show me what that camera can see in the corner. Now I can't do anything with that and I can't even exit back to control my player again. So it's not quite finished, but that's the basics of how to get multiple cameras working in your game. Let's go back into the editor and let's find a way to return our control back to the player so that the camera is following the player again. Now the tricky thing is, when I've interacted with this computer, my perspective changes to whatever this camera can see over here. And so that means, essentially, I can't interact with anything as easily as I could when I was behind the player. So we have to use the button presses that are going on that a script can listen for when it's attached to the user. We have to use the button presses part of the Crayta API to capture any interact events and revert control back to the player. So let's go to doing that. I'm going to open the user template in this dropdown, and I'm going to add a new script folder to this. Create child script folder, new script folder. And this is going to be called my camera. I'm just going to call it camera. In here, I'm going to add a script, entity add script, new script, and this is going to be called user camera. And then I'm going to edit this asset. So the user camera, what I need it to do is essentially listen out for button presses that are going on that the user is pressing. And if they hit the interact event, hit the interact button, I want to return the camera to the one that's on the player. So let's run function, user camera, on button press, on button pressed. And I can capture the button name in this bracket here. So this function will run whenever this chunk of code will run whenever someone presses a button. So whenever this user presses a button, it will run this function and it will pass in whatever button they've pressed as the button name. So if I do a conditional, like if button name is equal to interact, then if I do this conditional, then whenever they've pressed the interact button, let's just print something out for now. Print, swap camera back. Save that and return to the game. We're testing it out now. If I open up my console and press interact, you can see that that function is running whenever I press the interact button, regardless of whether I'm actually interacting with anything. What's also cool is if I go over to this computer and interact with that, even when I'm using this CCTV camera, that's outside of my player character, it still is registering when I'm pressing the interact button. So we can hook into that. We can hook into that function and essentially set the camera back to what it should be following our user. So we can do self get entity, which gets hold of the user. Remember, this script is attached to the user. Self get entity, set camera, and we want to set it to the player. So self get entity, and we can actually get the player from the user, get player. So we will set the camera to the player. You can set the camera to either a camera or a character in the game, which means you can spectate and ride along with other people, or you can set it up to be able to navigate between a bunch of different cameras, or you can set it to watch your own character. So let's run that. Now when I press interact, it will do that automatically. It's setting the camera behind the scenes. If I interact with this computer over here, it's changing the camera to be this one on the wall. And if I press interact again, it will return us back to the player. Now, technically, we're kind of doing a little bit of cheating there with our code, because in actual fact, when we're interacting, every time we're setting the camera, we should really only be doing that if we currently aren't set, if our camera is currently not set to be the player. So we could do something like if button name is equal to interact and self get entity, get camera. Not equal to self get entity, get player. So check whether the camera is equal to the player. And only if both of those conditions are true will this work. So now when I'm trying to interact, because my camera is already set to my player, it won't be doing anything. And now when I interact with this, there's nothing visible that changes. It's just a better way of doing it to make sure that you're not constantly setting that camera. It's just a little bit more defensive. If we did something else with cameras in the future, it would mean that we're a little bit more careful. So that's the basics of logging into a computer and showing a CCTV feed, and then going back to controlling the player. Some cool extensions you can do with this is something like I've attached with my player. If I go to my player template, I've attached a widget which essentially will display like a camera UI when you log into the camera. In this widget manager, you can see that I'm turning off the health, crosshair, and inventory view, and I'm showing the camera HUD widget when I do set to camera widgets. And when I run this function, I can swap it. So I can essentially swap between a player HUD and a camera HUD. And so to use these two functions, I need to, from the user camera, which is attached to the user here. So this script is attached to the user, and I need to call this script, which is attached to the player. And so I can do that, and it has to be called locally on the player as well. So it's a little bit more complex, but I can do that by going self get entity get player send to local, and the name of the script I want to send, or the name of the function I want to call, is set to player widgets. So this is when we're returning back to the player. We also want to run a function on the player here where we go, we're setting the camera, and then we also do player send to local. And what was the name of the other function? It's set to camera widgets. So let's run that event when we activate the camera. So if I test that now, I've left it visible. Let's go back to the player here, turn off the visibility of my camera HUD. Okay, so we've got our normal HUD. Go over here, interact with the PC, and I've got my camera HUD. So that it's really, really clear that I'm looking at it through a camera. And then if I interact again, I return to having my normal player HUD. So you can extend it a little bit like that by making it really, really clear that you're doing that. And the other thing, that you're interacting with the camera and you're not interacting with the player. One other problem is that even when I have this camera feed, I can still move my player around and actually rotate them and move them using mouse and keyboard or controls just like I normally would, which is absolutely fine. If you wanted to do that, and that's appropriate for your game, then that's totally cool. If it's not appropriate for your game, you can really easily turn that off. You just go to your camera script, which is attached to your camera. So I have this camera swapped script attached to my camera. And I'm setting the camera here. I'm turning on the camera widgets, and I can also set input locked to true. And that will mean that I can't move my player around. And we've got to do the inverse of that as well. We've got to set input lock to false, but we have to do that when we're setting it back to the normal player camera. So we do it here. There we go. So walk over to the screen, and now I can't move around no matter what I do with the mouse and keyboard. But if I press interact, I can still return back to my player. One thing. That set input locked isn't working. Because I don't have the player. Just make sure that you are actually doing that on the player and not just randomly calling a player variable like I was there. There we go. Okay, cool. So there we go. So yeah, I can now control the player, interact with this computer to look at what's going on that CCTV camera in the corner, and go back. Now, to extend this further, one thing you might want to do is to create an array of cameras and then maybe use the left and right buttons to navigate between that array of cameras. So do something like this where you have multiple screens to show that this is going to be an array of CCTV cameras, and then show one screen to show it's a single CCTV camera. That might be something fun that you want to do. Other things you could do is set the camera to being different players so that you ride along with different players and you never actually look at your own player and you have to guess who you are or something. I don't know. Yeah, there's lots of different things you can do with cameras. Have a play with them. Let me know what you think. And of course, if you get stuck with any of this stuff or the tutorial was a bit complex and a bit windy, so yeah, if you get a bit lost, then head over to the Discord. You feel free to @me and talk to some of the other the Crayta creators in there. Let us know how you get on, and I really look forward to seeing what you do with cameras in Crayta.